The widow's voice was barely above a whisper, but Jake Maddox heard every word. "Got any stale bread for my kids?" she asked the shopkeeper, her face flushed with shame. "The day-old kind you can't sell? I can pay a little. Not much, but something." Jake stood in the back corner of Miller's General Store, loading supplies into his saddlebag. He'd come to town for ammunition and coffee, not to witness a woman's humiliation. But he couldn't look away from the thin woman in the faded calico dress, or the 3 small children clinging to her skirts, their faces hollow with hunger. The shopkeeper, a fat man named Miller who'd gotten rich selling overpriced goods to desperate people, barely glanced at her. "Stale bread's still worth money, ma'am. 2 cents a loaf, fresh as 4. I only have 3 cents total." Miller shrugged. "Then you get 1 loaf of stale bread and a penny change. Take it or leave it." The woman's shoulders sagged. 3 children, 1 loaf of stale bread. Jake watched her pull a small cloth purse from her pocket with trembling fingers, counting out 3 precious pennies onto the counter. The oldest child, a girl maybe 8 years old, tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mama, is that enough?" "It'll have to be, sweetheart." Jake's jaw tightened. He knew that voice, knew that face, though it was thinner and more worn than he remembered from 10 years ago. Emma Crawford, Thomas Crawford's widow. And Jake Maddox owed Thomas Crawford a debt he could never fully repay. Jake Maddox wasn't called the Outlaw King for nothing. He'd earned the name through 15 years of living outside the law, or at least outside the corrupt version of law that ruled most of the Arizona territory. When crooked marshals took bribes and land barons hired killers to steal homesteads, Jake had made it his business to push back, hard. He'd robbed the stage carrying payroll money stolen from Mexican miners. He'd burned out the camps of claim jumpers who'd murdered legitimate prospectors. He'd run off more than 1 hired gun sent to terrorize farmers into selling their land for pennies. The territorial government had a $5,000 bounty on his head. The people who actually lived and worked this land considered him a hero. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. What people didn't know was that Jake owned the 2nd largest ranch in the territory under a different name, that he employed 40 men, ran 5,000 head of cattle, and had more money than most of the so-called respectable men who wanted him hanged, and that 10 years ago, a man named Thomas Crawford had saved his life. Jake was 22 then, cocky and stupid, leading his first raid against a corrupt land agent. He'd gotten shot, badly, and would have bled out in the desert if Thomas hadn't found him. Thomas was a rancher, a good man with a small spread and a young wife. He'd brought Jake to his ranch, hid him from the law, let his wife Emma nurse Jake back to health over 2 months. Thomas never asked for anything in return, never judged, just said that a man did what was right when he saw someone in need. Jake had ridden out when he was healed, promising Thomas that if he ever needed anything at all, he'd be there. 6 months ago, Jake had learned that Thomas was dead, killed 2 years earlier trying to stop a ranch fire that threatened their neighbor's land. He died a hero, saving 3 families' homes, but his own ranch had been lost. His wife and children turned out with nothing. Jake had been searching for Emma Crawford ever since, and now here she was, in Miller's General Store, begging for stale bread with 3 pennies and 3 hungry children. Jake stepped out of the shadows. Miller was wrapping the stale loaf in brown paper when Jake's voice cut across the store. "She'll take 6 loaves of fresh bread and a pound of bacon, 2 pounds of flour, pound of sugar, coffee, can of peaches, whatever else she needs." Every head in the store turned. Jake Maddox was hard to miss, 6'2", broad-shouldered with black hair that brushed his collar and eyes the color of cold steel. He wore black from hat to boots, with 2 Colt revolvers on his hips and the bearing of a man who'd walked through hell and come out the other side still standing. Miller's face went white. "Mr. Maddox, I didn't see you there." "I noticed." Jake's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of warning. The lady asked for bread. You were going to sell her stale bread for almost as much as fresh. I run a business, Mr. Maddox. I got costs. You got greed. There's a difference. Jake pulled a $20 gold piece from his pocket and set it on the counter with a sound like a judge's gavel. Get the lady what she needs. All of it. Fresh, good quality, and be quick about it. Miller scrambled to obey. Emma Crawford stared at Jake with wide eyes. She'd gone even paler than before. Her hand instinctively moved to gather her children closer. Jake's reputation had preceded him, clearly. I don't accept charity, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I can't pay you back. Good thing it's not charity, then. Jake looked at her directly for the first time. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Mrs. Crawford, been looking for you for 6 months. Her breath caught. You know me. I knew your husband, Thomas Crawford. He saved my life 10 years ago. I made him a promise. Time I kept it. Emma's hand went to her mouth. You're Jake, the man Thomas brought home that summer? The one who was shot? That's me, though I go by other names now. They call you the Outlaw King. Her voice shook. They say you're dangerous, that you rob and kill. They say a lot of things. Most of them aren't true. Some are. Jake's eyes were steady on hers. But I never broke a promise to a good man, and your husband was the best man I ever knew. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Her children pressed closer to her, sensing their mother's emotion but not understanding it. Miller finished loading supplies into a wooden crate, more food than Emma probably had seen in months. Bacon, flour, sugar, coffee, fresh bread, canned goods, dried beans, salt, even a small bag of peppermint sticks for the children. That's everything, Mr. Maddox. Comes to about $12. You got change coming. Jake waved him off. Keep it. Consider it payment for future business. His eyes hardened. Mrs. Crawford's business, which you'll conduct fairly from now on. Understand? Miller nodded so hard his jowl shook. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Jake picked up the heavy crate like it weighed nothing and turned to Emma. Got a wagon, or are you walking? We walked. It's only 2 miles. In this heat? With 3 children? Jake shook his head. My horse can carry this. You and the kids can ride in the back of Murphy's freight wagon. He owes me a favor. Mr. Maddox, I can't. Jake, and yes you can, because we need to talk, Mrs. Crawford, about your husband, about the promise I made him, about what happens next. Emma looked at her children, the 8-year-old girl, a boy of about 6, and a little one no more than 4, all of them thin, all of them watching the crate of food with hungry eyes. She'd been proud once. Jake could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she kept her chin up despite the shame of begging for stale bread. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. All right, she said quietly. All right, we'll talk. Murphy's freight wagon rattled down the dusty road toward the small shack Emma called home. Jake rode alongside on his black gelding, the supply crate secure behind his saddle. The children sat in the back of the wagon, already tearing into the peppermint sticks with the careful savoring of kids who rarely got sweets. Emma sat up front with Murphy, but her eyes kept drifting to Jake. I heard Thomas died, Jake said when they were out of town, 6 months ago. Took me this long to track you down. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. He died 2 years ago, Emma corrected quietly. Saving the Henderson place from a brush fire. He got 3 families out, but his voice cracked. The smoke got him. He died a hero. Everyone said so. He was always a hero, even when no one was watching. After he died, the bank took our ranch, said we owed money. I didn't understand all the papers,
Thomas handled that. They gave me a week to leave. She stared at her hands. I've been working when I can, sewing, washing, taking in ironing, but it's not enough. 3 children, winter coming. I don't. She didn't finish, didn't have to. Jake had seen this story too many times. Good people destroyed by bad systems. Widows and orphans cast aside by banks and land barons who cared more about profit than people. Thomas made me promise something, Jake said. That last day, when I rode out after you saved my life, he said if anything ever happened to him, I was to look after his family, make sure you were taken care of. He looked at her directly. I'm here to keep that promise. Mr. Maddox, Jake, you don't know us anything. You were grateful to Thomas. You've brought us food. That's more than enough. No, it's not. Not even close. Jake pulled his horse to a stop. Murphy halted the wagon. Mrs. Crawford, I'm going to be direct because that's the only way I know how. I own a ranch, big one, 20 miles north of here. It's run under a business partner's name because of my reputation, but it's mine. 5,000 head of cattle, 40 men working the land, big house that's empty except for me and my foreman. Emma stared at him. I don't understand. I'm offering you a job, housekeeper, cook, whatever title makes you comfortable. You and your children move into the ranch house. You get your own rooms, 3 meals a day, salary of $50 a month plus room and board. Your kids get schooling. I'll hire a teacher to come out or I'll pay for them to go to the school in town. Emma's mouth opened, closed. That's too much. Why would you? Because I owed your husband my life. Because I made him a promise. Because I got more money than I know what to do with and a house that's too damned empty. Jake's voice was rough. Because 3 kids shouldn't be going hungry while I'm sitting on a ranch bigger than some towns. That reason enough? Tears streamed down Emma's face. I don't. I can't. You can and you will, because Thomas would have done the same for anyone in need, and you're his wife. You raised those kids to be good and decent despite losing everything. That takes strength. That takes character. Jake's eyes were intense. I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Crawford. I'm offering a job to someone who's earned it. You take care of my house, I take care of your family. Fair trade? Emma looked back at her children in the wagon, at their thin faces and worn clothes, and the hope beginning to spark in their eyes as they overheard the conversation. What about your reputation? She asked quietly. You're wanted by the law. If I work for you, if my children live at your ranch, my ranch is run legally under my partner's name. Far as anyone knows, you work for Samuel Garrett, respectable rancher. They don't need to know I'm the real owner. You'll be safe. Your children will be safe. I promise you that. And if the law comes for you, they've been trying for 15 years. Haven't caught me yet. Jake's smile was thin. And if they do, the ranch stays in Samuel's name. Your job's secure either way. I've made sure of that legally. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. When she looked at Jake again, there was something new in her expression. Not just gratitude, understanding, respect. Thomas told me about you, she said softly, that last year before he died. He said you were the most honorable outlaw he'd ever met, that you fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves, that underneath all the darkness, you were a good man trying to make a bad world a little better. Thomas saw the best in people, sometimes more than was there. No, he saw the truth. Emma straightened her shoulders. All right, I accept. For my children, and because Thomas would tell me I'm a fool if I let pride stand in the way of their future. Jake felt something loosen in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying for 6 months, for 2 years, maybe for 10 years. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you, Emma replied, for keeping your promise, for... Her voice broke again.
for giving us hope. The Maddox Ranch, officially the Garrett Ranch, sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land. The ranch house was built of adobe and timber, 2 stories with a wide porch and enough rooms for a family 3 times the size of Emma's. When the wagon pulled up to the house, Emma's children stared in silent awe. This is where we're gonna live?" the oldest girl whispered. "This is home now, Sarah," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. Jake's foreman, a grizzled old rancher named Pete, who'd worked for Jake for 10 years, came out to greet them. He'd been briefed on the situation, and his weathered face crinkled into a smile when he saw the children. "Mrs. Crawford, welcome. Jake told me you'd be coming. We got rooms all ready for you upstairs. 3 bedrooms, 1 for you, 1 for the girls, 1 for the boy. I had the Mexican women from town come out yesterday and clean everything, put fresh lemons on all the beds." Emma looked at Jake, overwhelmed. 3 bedrooms? That's too much. "It's what's available. Use them." Jake dismounted and started unloading the supply crate. "Pete, show Mrs. Crawford and her kids to their rooms. Let them get settled. I'll get these supplies to the kitchen." Over the next hour, Emma discovered that getting settled meant more than just rooms. Each bedroom had real beds with thick mattresses and quilts. The children's rooms had toys, wooden horses, a doll with a china face, picture books. Emma's room had a wardrobe filled with dresses in her size, all simple but well made and clean. "I don't understand," Emma said when Jake brought the last of the supplies to the kitchen. "The clothes, the toys, how did you—" "I've been looking for you for 6 months. Last month I found out you had 3 kids, got their approximate ages and sizes, figured you'd need more than just food when I found you." He set the crate on the large wooden table. "If the sizes are wrong, we'll get 'em fixed." Emma picked up one of the dresses, dark blue calico with white buttons. It was beautiful. Practical, exactly her size. "You did all this for people you hadn't seen in 10 years? "I did it because I made a promise to a man who saved my life." Jake's voice was quiet. "And because I know what it's like to have nothing, to be hungry, to wonder if you'll survive another day. I was orphaned at 12, lived on the streets until I was old enough to work ranches. Then I was cheated out of my wages, beaten for standing up for myself, and left to dead more times than I can count. I got lucky. I got strong. I got mean enough to survive, but I never forgot what it felt like to be helpless, to be hungry, to have no one." Emma's eyes filled with tears again. "Thomas saved the right man. Thomas saved a lot of people. I'm just trying to pass it on." Over the following weeks, Emma and her children settled into life at the ranch.
Emma proved to be an excellent housekeeper and an even better cook. The ranch hands, who'd been living on Pete's barely edible stews and burned biscuits, sang her praises after the first meal. Her children blossomed. The hollows in their cheeks filled out. They laughed, played, learned to ride horses under Pete's patient instruction. Jake hired a young school teacher from town, a recent widow herself named Mrs. Henderson, whose husband had been one of the men Thomas Crawford saved in that fire. She came 3 days a week to teach the children reading, writing, and arithmetic. Emma watched it all with wonder and gratitude that she expressed in 1,000 small ways. Fresh flowers on the dining table, Jake's shirts mended perfectly, his favorite meals appearing as if by magic. One evening, about a month after Emma arrived, Jake found her sitting on the porch after the children were in bed. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "It's your porch. It's your home now, too." Jake sat in the chair beside hers. They were quiet for a moment, watching the sunset. "I got a telegram today," Emma said finally, "from the bank that took our ranch. They're being investigated for fraud. Apparently they've been forging debt documents for years, stealing homesteads from widows and selling them to land speculators. She looked at Jake. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that investigation, would you?" Jake's expression didn't change. "Might have mentioned to a federal marshal I know that certain banks in the territory were operating outside the law. Might have provided some documentation I'd collected over the years. Documentation you just happen to have. I'm thorough." Emma smiled. It transformed her face, washing away the worry and hardship, and revealing the beautiful woman she'd been before life had beaten her down. "You're also careful not to take credit for the good you do. Everyone calls you an outlaw, a criminal, but you're more honest than most lawmen I've known. The law and justice aren't always the same thing. No, they're not." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas used to say that. He said you understood the difference better than anyone, that you were willing to be called a villain if it meant doing what was right. Thomas saw me better than I saw myself. He had that gift. He saw the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it themselves." She turned to look at Jake directly. "He would be proud of you for keeping your promise, for giving us this life, for being the man he believed you were." "I hope so. I know so." Emma reached over and took his hand. It was the first time she'd touched him since that day in the store. Her hand was small but strong, calloused from work but gentle. "Thank you, Jake, for everything, for being our guardian angel when we had no one else." "I'm no angel. Maybe not, but you're a good man, no matter what anyone else says." They sat there in the dying light, hands joined, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. And for the first time in 15 years of living outside the law, of being called an outlaw and a criminal and worse, Jake Maddox felt something he hadn't felt since the day Thomas Crawford saved his life. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 6 months later, the territorial governor issued a pardon for Jake Maddox. It turned out that the federal investigation Emma had mentioned uncovered more than just banking fraud. It revealed a network of corruption involving the territorial marshal, several judges, and half the land barons in Arizona. The same men who'd put the bounty on Jake's head were being arrested for crimes that made Jake's activities look like Sunday school. The new governor, a reformer from back east, reviewed Jake's case and concluded that most of his so-called crimes were acts of vigilante justice against men who deserved it. He pardoned Jake completely and even issued a public statement thanking him for services to the people of Arizona Territory in the face of systemic corruption. Jake was free to use his real name again, free to run his ranch openly, free to live without looking over his shoulder. Emma insisted on cooking a celebration dinner. The entire ranch, 40 cowboys, Pete, Mrs. Henderson, and Emma's children gathered for a feast that became legendary in local history. Afterward, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children were in bed, Jake and Emma sat on the porch again. It had become their evening ritual. A quiet hour after the day's work, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. "You're a free man now," Emma said. "No more hiding, no more running. What will you do?" "I don't know. Never thought I'd have the choice. Always figured I'd die with a bullet in my back or a rope around my neck. You have choices now. All of them." "Do I?" Jake looked at her. Over the past 6 months, he'd come to know Emma Crawford more than just Thomas's widow or his housekeeper. She was intelligent, strong, funny when she let himself be, and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with spirit. "Because there's one choice I'd like to make, but I don't know if I have the right." Emma's breath caught. "What choice is that?" "The choice to ask if you'd consider letting this arrangement become permanent. Not just as my housekeeper, as He stopped, suddenly uncertain. As my wife, if you could ever see me that way, if it wouldn't dishonor Thomas's memory, if you... Emma kissed him. It was soft and brief and tasted like hope and second chances. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Thomas told me something before he died. He said if anything happened to him, if I ever found someone else, someone good who could make me happy and take care of our children, I should take that chance. He said life's too short to live it alone out of duty to the dead. He said that. He did. Because he was a good man who wanted me to be happy even if he couldn't be there to make it so. You're a good man too, Jake Maddox. You kept a promise for 10 years. You searched for 6 months to find us. You gave us everything without asking for anything in return. You gave my children a future. You gave me hope when I'd lost it all. I gave you what you deserved, what Thomas would have wanted for you. And now I'm giving you what you deserve. A family, a home, a wife who sees you for who you really are, not what the world calls you. She smiled. If you'll have us. If I'll have you. Jake laughed, and it was a sound of pure joy. Emma Crawford, I've been in half love with you since the day you and Thomas saved my life. I just never thought I deserved a second chance at happiness. We all deserve second chances. Thomas believed that. I believe it too. She leaned forward and kissed him again, longer this time. Say yes, Jake.
Yes, Jake said against her lips. Yes to everything. To you, to your children, to this life, to whatever comes next. Then it's settled. Emma rested her head on his shoulder, and Jake wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. We're a family now. We're a family, Jake agreed. And somewhere, Jake liked to think, Thomas Crawford was smiling. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Emma's children stood beside them, beaming. Pete and the ranch hands cheered. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears. And the man once known as the Outlaw King became simply Jake Maddox, rancher, husband, and father to 3 children who called him Papa within a year. The ranch prospered, the children grew strong and educated. Emma's laughter filled the house that had been too empty for too long. And every evening, Jake and Emma sat on the porch watching the sunset, grateful for second chances and the promises that had brought them together. Years later, when people asked Jake about the pardon and his transformation from outlaw to respected rancher, he always told the same story about a good man named Thomas Crawford who saved a stranger's life, about a promise made and kept, about a widow asking for stale bread, and about how sometimes doing the right thing means being called wrong until the world catches up with the truth. I spent 15 years as an outlaw, but the only law that ever mattered to me was the law of keeping your word to good people. Thomas kept his word when he saved me. I kept mine when I found his family. And now we're all exactly where we're supposed to be. Emma, listening from the kitchen, would smile and shake her head at her husband's tendency to downplay his own goodness. But she'd also remember that day in Miller's General Store, her shame, her desperation, her fear, and the voice from the shadows that changed everything. The lady asked for bread. Sometimes, she'd tell her children when they were old enough to understand, angels wear black and carry guns and have prices on their heads. Sometimes justice doesn't come from judges or laws. Sometimes it comes from a man keeping a 10-year-old promise in a general store on a hot Arizona afternoon. And sometimes, Emma would say with tears in her eyes and love in her voice, the bravest thing a strong man can do
is show kindness to the helpless when no one's watching. Jake Maddox had done exactly that, and in doing so, he'd saved more than just a widow and her children. He'd saved himself. If this story of unexpected kindness and kept promises touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever experienced or witnessed an act of generosity that changed someone's life? Share your stories, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of honor, redemption, and the good that exists even in rough places. Thanks for reading, and I'll see you in the next story.
Yes, Jake said against her lips, yes to everything, to you, to your children, to this life, to whatever comes next. Then it's settled. Emma rested her head on his shoulder, and Jake wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. We're a family now. We're a family, Jake agreed. And somewhere, Jake liked to think, Thomas Crawford was smiling. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Emma's children stood beside them, beaming. Pete and the ranch hands cheered. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears, and the man once known as the Outlaw King became simply Jake Maddox, rancher, husband, and father to 3 children who called him Papa within a year. The ranch prospered. The children grew strong and educated. Emma's laughter filled the house that had been too empty for too long. And every evening, Jake and Emma sat on the porch, watching the sunset, grateful for second chances and the promises that had brought them together. Years later, when people asked Jake about the pardon and his transformation from outlaw to respected rancher, he always told the same story. About a good man named Thomas Crawford who saved a stranger's life. About a promise made and kept. About a widow asking for stale bread. And about how sometimes doing the right thing means being called wrong until the world catches up with the truth. I spent 15 years as an outlaw, Jake would say, but the only law that ever mattered to me was the law of keeping your word to good people. Thomas kept his word when he saved me. I kept mine when I found his family. And now we're all exactly where we're supposed to be. Emma, listening from the kitchen, would smile and shake her head at her husband's tendency to downplay his own goodness. But she'd also remember that day in Miller's General Store. Her shame, her desperation, her fear, and the voice from the shadows that changed everything. The lady asked for bread. Sometimes she'd tell her children when they were old enough to understand, angels wear black and carry guns and have prices on their heads. Sometimes justice doesn't come from judges or laws. Sometimes it comes from a man keeping a 10-year-old promise in a general store on a hot Arizona afternoon. And sometimes, Emma would say with tears in her eyes and love in her voice, the bravest thing a strong man can do is show kindness to the helpless when no one's watching. Jake Maddox had done exactly that, and in doing so, he'd saved more than just a widow and her children. He'd saved himself.